Our final speaker for the first QED conference, the Director of Educational Studies at the National Center for something very important. Please welcome the one and only Genie Scott.
You know, it's really nice being the head of the National Center of something important and having won the Nobel Prize in Patience. I mean, what more can I ask? This has been a fine meeting, and really, thank you so much for hanging in here. I mean, the last speaker on the last day, this is not an easy gig, and thank you so much for being here. Well, the title is Why Evolution is Difficult. It's not just going to be an American perspective, because evolution is difficult, and it's not just American, it's actually an international problem as well. But of course, everyone is familiar with the diagram in this article. This article from Science Magazine, Miller, Scott, and Okamoto, 2006, I was told was the most requested graphic that Science Magazine has had in the last 10 years or so. It really struck a nerve. We asked the questions, humans evolved from earlier forms of animals, true or false? And just so you didn't go blind looking at that tiny print there, the blue is true, the yellow is not sure, the red is false. And we beat Turkey. There. You know, Americans have this thing about being number one from the bottom. But anti-evolution in the U.S. has been depressingly consistent. Gallup polls since the 1980s show lower acceptance of evolution compared to other countries. In these data, the top line is humans were specially created, and the numbers here form in the mid to the high 40%. The middle line is that humans evolved, but this evolution was guided by God, again, middle to high 40s. And the bottom line is humans evolved, but God was not involved, and the data here, 10, 12%, something like that. Now, what's kind of interesting is that if you, there was another slide here, but oh well, never mind. Interestingly enough, if you compare the total number of Americans who accept some form of evolution, either God-guided evolution or evolution with God having nothing to do with it, it's about 50%, which is not great. But the focus tends to be on that rather high percentage of Americans that deny evolution totally, and that's, you know, mid to high 40s. A word about polls. I'm sure you're familiar with the celebrity statistician margin of error. Always takes a little bit, but that's okay. Well, it is the wording of the question, and it makes a difference whether you give people a 3-point answer, you know, agree, not sure, disagree, or a 5-point answer, agree very much, don't agree very much, don't know. With the 5-point answer, you tend to increase the mushy middle. You get fewer extreme positions. So there's all sorts of problems with survey research. And so I would certainly encourage you whenever you read a poll of any kind, but survey research on creation and evolution especially, consider very carefully how the question was asked. There's a lot of bad information out there about this controversy, partly because the survey research data has not always been conducted with the clearest standards in mind. George Bishop has shown that respondents will show higher acceptance of evolution if humans are not mentioned. And they will also, respondents will show higher acceptance of evolution if the respondents aren't primed by the mention of the Bible or by God or any sort of religious component. Once that gets introduced at all, the percentage of people, wherever, accepting evolution goes down. But there has been quite a bit of international comparisons in addition to the data that Miller et al. Were discussing. The Science and Engineering Indicators in 2008 published a lot of these data. These are surveys given every 2 years in the United States, sponsored by the National Science Board. And the question, the continents have been moving their location for millions of years and will continue to move, true or false, was actually answered by a fairly high percentage of Americans. Close to 80% of Americans agree, which certainly is a great deal higher than the percentage of Russians, Chinese, Indians, or Malaysians, which all countries that scored all more poorly on that. There tends to be a tendency that as long as people aren't involved, sometimes evolutionary ideas like continental drift are more acceptable, but the human exceptionalism component certainly is in there and cannot be denied. I don't have any idea why the percentages of acceptance of continental drift are so low in those other nations. Maybe this concept just is not presented in the classroom. I just don't know. And yet, the science and engineering indicators questions about the Big Bang show that Americans, again, are very low in their acceptance compared to other countries, probably, again, for religious reasons. In the beginning, not in the beginning boom, was sort of what most people are more familiar with. But of course, when it comes to human evolution, Americans show high percentages of rejection. To understand why, it's useful to know something about the structure of American religion. And one of the best surveys is the Pew Foundation American Religious Landscape Survey, which looked at Americans' claims about their religious affiliation. People were asked, what are you? And they would respond. A very high percentage of Americans are Christians, which is the sort of middle blue there. I didn't really mean it to look like Pac-Man especially, but that's just the way I just learned how to do pie diagrams in PowerPoint 2 nights ago when I was working on this. So you get lots of pie diagrams today. The no affiliation group there, that green slice, is a rather interesting one, 16%. Now, sometimes this is misunderstood to suggest that 16% of Americans are atheists, and therefore the percentage of atheists in the United States increased over the years. Actually, that just means that 16% have no religious affiliation. Actually, only a small percentage of that 16% identifies as either atheists or agnostics. And I want to show you a little bit more about that unaffiliated group. Again, they remain the green color there on this particular pie chart. A substantial proportion of this unaffiliated group is nothing in particular. Only a very small slice is atheist and agnostics. Those are those 2 lighter blue slices there. And then there's 2 kinds of nothing in particular. There's nothing in particular but religious, nothing in particular non-religious. But if you add up the secular nothings, so to speak, and those who specifically identify themselves as atheists or agnostics, you get about 10% of Americans who are non-believers. And actually, this percentage is pretty much what it's been in survey research data for decades in the United States. The percentage of atheism may be growing in the United States. These data were collected in 2007, maybe in the last 3 years, who knows. But we don't have data to say that now. Although this is a claim that you run into a lot on the internet, and part of it is based upon these Pew data, but just not understanding what unaffiliated means here. But let's take a look at this blue chunk, at the Christian percentage of Americans, which is really very, very high. It's 78%. There's a wide variety of Christian orientations in the United States, and they can be roughly divided into mainstream Christians and conservative Christians. It's really hard to talk about subdivisions of Christianity in the United States or elsewhere, partly because terms like evangelical or fundamentalist are not used consistently even within the Christian community. And people outside the Christian community really don't know what these terms mean, by and large. The term that they prefer is conservative Christian, which refers to conservative Christian theology, not necessarily political conservatism. In fact, some of the more lefty, if you will, environmentalists happen to be the green Christians, the creation care and stewardship group of evangelical Christians. But conservative Christians tend to be religiously conservative. It includes the born-again Christians and those attributing similar statements of faith about the personal relationship with God, the mediation of salvation through Jesus, the belief, and this is where it's important for science, the belief that the Bible is inerrant, and that kind of tends to roll over into literally true. Inerrancy is not the same thing as literalism. Again, these are terms that are more familiar in the theological community than in ours. But they're not identical, but there's a lot of implication of literal truth when it comes to literal truth of the Bible among conservative Christians in America. It includes fundamentalists, most evangelicals, but also holiness, Pentecostalists, charismatics, lots and lots of the wonderful fruit salad of American Christianity, which involves so many different denominations. So if you look especially at the rather large group of mainstream Christians, which is about 46% of Americans, you're dealing with Catholics and mainstream Protestants whose formal theology accepts evolution. In theological terms, it's something called theistic evolution, that evolution happened, but it was the way God chose to bring it about, and there's this whole continuum of theistic evolution, just as there's a whole continuum of creationist views in general. So it's useful to remember that not all religious people are opposed to evolution. In the United States, I often point out to people that more evolution is taught in Catholic schools, Catholic parochial schools, than in public schools. And one of my favorite anecdotes is a NCSE member from Texas who told me that he was sending his kid to the Lutheran parochial school so that she would learn evolution. So there's a lot of stereotypes about religion and evolution. NCSE's book, Voices for Evolution, includes a selection of statements from religious organizations, mostly mainstream Protestant, Catholic, and some Jews, attesting to the acceptability of evolution within their denominations. But certainly it's no surprise that in the United States you have a very low acceptance of evolution. The data I was showing you before from Miller, Scott, and Okamoto was 2006. A more recent 2009 survey by the British Council shows much the same information. The U.S. is very low. The specific question asked that I'm presenting in this slide is, enough scientific evidence exists to support Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and the United States is down at the bottom. We beat Egypt in this case. And yet, even in Darwin's own nation, Great Britain, only 62% agreed with this question about the sufficiency of scientific data for evolution. And in this other question from the Theos Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in 2009, they probed more carefully for views on the legitimacy of evolution as a scientific theory. And as you see here in the second, evolution is a theory that is still waiting to be proved or disproved. Only 36% of your countrymen, well, I should say, a high percentage, a third of your countrymen think that evolution might still not quite be, there. So we can certainly sympathize in the United States. We have some of the same problems. He's not president anymore. But that was a famous statement that he made about evolution. But at the National Center for Science Education, for those of you not familiar with our work, we monitor the creation and evolution controversy, but we also work at the grassroots to support the teachers and school boards and parents and scientists and anybody else who are concerned about the efforts, long-going efforts in the United States to try to bring some type of religious view into the science classroom. And we provide people with the information and the advice that they need to stop these things from happening. I've often used the metaphor that we hand out the fire extinguishers for the various brush fires around. What we've learned over the last, and that's not the royal we, this is my staff and I, have learned over the last 25 years of dealing with this issue at NCSE, is that this is not a simple one variable problem. That the creation and evolution controversy is only partly about science. It is also about religion. It's about education, both educational policy as well as pedagogy. It's about the law. It's about politics. It's about culture. It's about history. Different countries responded differently to these variables, affecting how evolution and creationism are viewed. Universally, though, we find that you can pretty much summarize all of the creationist arguments into one of three categories, which we've taken to calling, in Glenn Branch's phrase, the pillars of creationism. The first one, of course, being that evolution is invalid science. Scientists are giving up on evolution. Like that Faraday Institute slide that I showed you a moment before, evolution may not really be as well, it's still on its way to becoming a real science. Or alternatively, it's a theory in crisis in other ways. It's off the map already. This comes as a real surprise, by the way, to the science community. But this is repeated over and over and over and over. And this is not just in the United States. This is all over the world. The second of the pillars of creationism is the idea that you have to choose between faith, particularly Christian faith, although increasingly Islam as well, and evolution, that there is a dichotomous choice here between the two. The third argument is in many respects the most interesting and is also the most difficult. And this is the fairness argument, that if you're going to teach evolution, be fair and balance it with something else. So teach evolution and balance it with creationism. Well, in the United States, that didn't last long because, of course, we have the First Amendment to our Constitution that requires that public institutions like schools or the government have to be religiously neutral. It's the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. It's interesting stuff. Really good idea, by the way. And as a result, you simply cannot advocate a religious view in our public schools. The next argument was, well, teach evolution, but balance it with something called creation science, about which I'll talk in a moment. That didn't work either from a legal standpoint. Those efforts were struck down by the courts. Well, okay, teach evolution, but balance it with the teaching of intelligent design. That didn't last very long either. Mercifully, the courts have also spoken on that. And full disclosure here, that's Kitzmiller versus Dover. My staff and I acted as legal advisors to the plaintiffs' team on that. We acted as science and education advisors to the plaintiffs' legal team. We don't give legal advice. Now, what we're seeing is, well, teach evolution, but balance it with the evidence against evolution, with the strengths and weaknesses of evolution, or a critical analysis of evolution, sounding very, very even-handed and very fair and just chock full of critical thinking. And it is this critical thinking aspect of the fairness pillar that we are dealing with the most here, in which I will have more to say specifically in the context of Great Britain. A correlate to this cultural favoritism for fairness, which is certainly very strong in our country, in your country, many Western countries, is to give equal weight to scientists who accept evolution and scientists who oppose evolution. There is a somewhat cynical phrase, shall we say, that lawyers used about expert witnesses. For every PhD, there is an equal and opposite PhD. And of course, that's really not true. But when you have a blog or a TV show or a movie or something, and you have scientist A and scientist B, well, gee, it must be equal then, because they must be equally valid arguments. And that's really not the way it is with creation and evolution, because when you look at the huge number of scientists who are over there on the evolution side, and the paucity of scientists that are over there on the creationism side, whether you toss in all of the intelligent design creationists or whoever, you find that the numbers are just simply overwhelming. Now, a manifestation of this, there are lots of scientists against evolution idea, was a campaign that the Discovery Institute conducted a number of years ago to list scientists skeptical of Darwinism. A scientific dissent from Darwinism is what that poster says. And there's a little statement there that they attested to, and there's the names of the 100 scientists doubting Darwin. This is a really dumb idea, you know? I mean, it's like we decide the validity of a scientific idea by how many people vote for it, you know? And of course, that's not how, you know, that's not how, these guys may all be right, but you know, the fact that there are more scientists who think that evolution works and is a valid scientific idea doesn't make them right either. I mean, the reason why we accept a scientific explanation is because it helps us understand nature. Evolution helps us understand nature really well. But you know, but it's not because there's a list of scientists longer than accepting evolution than the list of scientists doubting evolution. So, of course, as soon as this came out, you know, NCSE was just deluged with very annoyed scientists who wanted us to start a petition. We would get tens and tens and thousands of scientists signing a petition in favor of evolution, and we'll really show these silly creationists. And we thought, no, that's a dumb idea, too. You know, it's equally dumb to have a list of scientists doubting Darwin as to have a list of scientists accepting Darwin. And what's this Darwin bit? Sorry, guys. I mean, he was really a fine fellow, but we don't refer to physics as Kelvinism, all right? And we really don't refer to evolution as Darwinism. We refer to evolutionary biology or geology or astronomy. In evolutionary biology, we would be Dobzhanskyists as much as we would be Darwinists when you come right down to it. But in the United States and through American exports, Darwinism has become an epithet. Darwinism is an ideology. It's an ideology of atheism. And of course, we don't want our children being taught ideologies in school, now do we? So, you know, there's a reason why the Discovery Institute said scientific dissent from Darwinism instead of a scientific dissent from evolution. This wasn't by choice. Well, we were also really annoyed, but we didn't think it was a good idea to have a list of tens of thousands of scientists accepting evolution, because that just misleads the public about what's going on here. So instead, we got 200 scientists signing a statement about, you know, evolution is a well-supported unifying principle of biological sciences. I won't bore you with the entire statement, but it was a nice couple of little sentences that was very good. We got twice as many scientists as they did, but all of ours were named Steve. And the press got it, too. Dr. Steve Morton, would you please stand up? Steve! Yay! And when Steve came up to me today, and I saw he was here, and I was so delighted, I asked him to please wear his shirt. And did you notice how he was modeling his Steve shirt, which has the statement on the front and all the names of the Steves in back? If I may be permitted a small amount of boasting, I am the author of an article in the Journal of Improbable Research. Thank you. Not many are called, and even fewer are chosen. My colleagues from NCSE wrote an article called The Morphology of Steve, co-authored by 439 Steves. Because we had T-shirt sizes and addresses for each Steve or Stephanie. I mean, of course. We'll take Esteban's, Etienne's, you know, Steve's and cognates. Because we had T-shirt sizes and geographic locations, addresses for Steve's or Stephanie, we realized we had a minimal publishable unit. And we had an opportunity to contribute to original research, which doesn't happen often at NCSE, to analyze factors relating to sexual dimorphism between Steves and Stephanies. Unlike many other mammals, Stephanies are bigger than Steves. There were 4 Stephanies, and one of them got an extra, extra large shirt, so there goes the mean. Some of you may notice we are doing central tendency statistics with ordinal data, but, you know, let's not get fussy. Let's not get fussy about it. We were able to correlate Steve's size with latitude, thus disproving Bergman's rule, which those of you who are biologists would appreciate. And we had a number of other observations, too numerous to report, but the article is online. If you just Google the morphology of Steve, you will find it. A surprising number of those 439 Steve co-authors have listed this in their vitas. The reason I'm going into this is nothing to do with my talk, but this is the last talk of the last day, and I got to do something to keep you people interested. Now, one salient analysis that we performed was comparing domestic Steves with wild or foreign Steves. The samples for which you see in the diagram. And when we plotted out these data, we were able to discover the confirmation of a long-recognized biological principle affecting mammals on islands. Steves exhibit island dwarfism. And speaking of Australia, I will now return to your regularly scheduled program. Anti-evolutionism has not been restricted to the United States. Creationism as a movement has been almost as long-lived in Australia as it has in the United States. By the mid-1970s, ambassadors from the Institute of Creation Research, including the famous evolutionist debater biochemist Duane Gish and physicist Harold Schlecher, were invited by Australian creationists to speak and help build the Australian creationist movement. Australian creationists were followers, and are followers, of Henry M. Morris, who is the founder of Creation Science and a founding member of the Institute for Creation Research, still the best known and most revered of the American creationist organizations. Now, creation science is an interesting wrinkle in the history of creationism, which I've written about and talked about elsewhere. It's a fascinating history. We just don't have time for everything today. But creation science is the idea that you can take the special creation view of the Bible and support it with scientific evidence, which has got to be a stretch, at least if you know very much science. Special creationism is really the key to understanding the creationist movement nationally in the U.S. or internationally. It deals with the idea that all Christians accept that God created, but it's a specific view of how God created, and that's what makes it special creationism. God creates everything in its present form, for example, in special creationism. So baboons are created to look like baboons, and humans like humans, and pine trees like pine trees, and barnacles like barnacles, speaking of Darwin. And there wasn't any common ancestry of, say, cats and dogs. There's the dog kind and the cat kind, not a common ancestral carnivore kind, for example. They also believe that the kinds of organisms were created with limited genetic variability, so that the dog kind could get off the ark, for example. Dogs, I think, are clean, so the 7 pairs of dog kind would get off the ark and then radiate out into dogs and coyotes and wolves and jackals and all the other members of the dog kind. But there's limited genetic variability in the dog kind, in the created dog kind. So dogs were specially created, and they will never evolve into anything else. And they don't share common ancestry with anything else. In the most common form of special creationism, this event took place at one time, the 6 days of creation in Genesis. But really, the most important aspect of special creationism is this creation of things in their present form, which is why, even though most of the intelligent design supporters believe that the Earth is billions of years old and the geological column is accurate, that single-celled organisms occurred first, and then simple multicelled organisms, and then more complex metazoa, and then the Cambrian explosion, and then amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals and lions and tigers and bears and all that. even though they believe that all of that is correct in the geological column and that it is not the case that everything was created all at one kind. They still are special creationists because they believe that each of those entities are separate creations. They're really progressive creationists. The intelligent design people, most of them believe in this sequential creation. But the important thing here is that the creation of things in their present form, which is the idea that is completely incompatible with the idea of evolution. Many Christian views are compatible, this one is not. Well, the best known of the Australian creationists is Ken Ham, who moved to the United States in 1987 to work for the Institute for Creation Research and began promoting a rather more evangelical form of creationism than the usual kind of sciencey stuff that you found at the ICR. And these were called Answers in Genesis. And they were hugely successful. And when Ham left in 1994, he took the name Answers in Genesis with him and formed his own creationist ministry in northern Kentucky, outside of the city of Cincinnati. And this later became the name of the Australian creationist organization as well. Now, Ham's greatest claim to fame is the erection of the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky. His headquarters comprises about 30,000 square feet of this building, and the museum another 70,000 square feet. It is a really impressive edifice, believe me. And they reached their millionth visitor in 2010, almost exactly 3 years after the May 2007 opening. And Ham's staff is very good at merchandising. As you approach the museum in northern Kentucky, the billboards will say things like "Prepare to Believe," and this really quite dramatic sign, too, encouraging you to stop off at the museum. The Australian Answers in Genesis and Ham's Answers in Genesis have international programs, and at one time claimed international branches in Great Britain, Canada, Singapore, South Africa, and New Zealand, some of these branches being more active than others. But we've, and in fact, let us turn to Great Britain here, because we also see creationism appearing within the recent decade. A couple of years ago, British scientists were shocked at the allegation that creationism was being taught in some of the state-run schools. In the British academies, which are set up for low-performing school districts, groups of parents, nonprofits, businesses, and so forth can put up 10% of the funds to take over a failing school. The government puts up 90%, and they're given a relatively free hand. Sir Peter Vardy, a wealthy Briton who made a fortune in car dealerships, has set up 3 of these schools through the Vardy Foundation and is planning more. By law, schools have to teach the national curriculum, but there are reports that the Vardy academies undermine it when it comes to evolution. When the first Vardy school was opened in 2002, Prime Minister Tony Blair was pressed by a number of scientists and other scholars to address the issue, but he kept his hands off. His argument was that the Vardy Foundation schools were getting good scores, so he wasn't going to interfere. In 2009, I was at a conference on science education in York. Excuse me, where did that happen? Go back here. In York, where I spoke with a number of teachers from Great Britain as well as teachers around the world who were very concerned about pressure from Muslim students and parents on teachers to avoid the teaching of evolution or to bring in the Bible, some of the same pressures that, of course, we've faced in the United States. And as I will discuss in a little bit, many Muslim students are very reluctant to be taught evolution as a part of science. And this is having a somewhat chilling effect upon science instruction in Great Britain. But just to quickly look at a few other countries, Italy is another country in which the National Center for Science Education has recorded conflict over the teaching of evolution. In February 2004, the Italian Minister of Education, Letizia Moratti, removed evolutionary topics from the curriculum for middle school 13 to 14-year-olds. And this was geological evolution, biological evolution, and human evolution and culture. Evolution would be taught in high school, but primarily as something to be criticized. The argument originally was made that middle school students were really too young to understand evolution, so the topic would be dropped. And the criticism of evolution was couched in very familiar terms. This was a critical thinking exercise for students. They would be presented evolution, of course, but they would also be presented with the objections to evolution. Well, science teachers didn't like this. A group of distinguished scientists weighed in on this controversy. And the Prime Minister apparently leaned on the Minister of Education, and by the end of April, she had withdrawn the policy of dropping evolution. A controversy over evolution also occurred in Siberia. Serbia. There's a difference. The education minister, Liliana Čolić, announced in September 2004 that evolution would be dropped in 8th grade biology and in the future would not be taught unless creationism were taught along with it. There was a very strong over my dead body reaction from Serbian scientists and researchers, teachers, the Serbian Academy of Science and Arts, and some 40 non-government organizations and human rights groups got up in arms about this and protested strongly. The head of the Serbian Orthodox Church came in on the side of teaching evolution, and several groups called for her resignation, which actually, although this cartoon shows Darwin getting the boot, it happened to be the case that, on the contrary, Ms. Čolić ended up resigning shortly thereafter. There's also been a rather interesting controversy about evolution in Brazil. After requiring schools to institute religious education, the Brazilian state of Rio de Janeiro then required that teachers should teach creationism. And this, of course, had Brazilian scientists in an uproar, but apparently they were unable to reverse the policy. I don't read Portuguese, and I don't really know whether there was much follow-up. But perhaps some of the most interesting examples of international creationism come from the Muslim world, and nowhere is it more interesting than in Turkey. Adnan Oktar, better known by his pen name of Harun Yahya, is a leading Turkish creationist. He heads the Science Research Foundation, or BAV in Turkish, which apparently can raise a lot of money. Inspired by American young earth creationists, Gish and Morris came over to Turkey to promote young earth creationism in the 80s and 90s. Basically, what Harun Yahya has done is kind of take the anti-evolution part, take the design part, and just sort of ignore the young earth part. They're not very interested in that. Kind of ignored the Jesus part, too. But a lot of focus on design and a lot of focus on all the things that are wrong with evolution. Now, under the pen name of Harun Yahya, Oktar, and one can only assume his staff, have written hundreds of books and pamphlets. No one person can write that much. Mostly it's very highly derivative of ICR and other creationist materials, some of it just repeated over and over in different books, and very free use of copyrighted materials. Anti-evolutionism in the Islamic world even beats that in the U.S. Salman Hamid's data reported in Science in December 12, 2008, if you're interested in looking up the article. The pink bars mean evolution is true or probably true. The green is not possibly true, and there's a lot wider green bars there on there for the various nations that were surveyed. Again, my experience at the York Education Conference and also at a 2009 conference I attended in Alexandria, I was told that Muslim students really don't want to hear about evolution. Many of them will just get up and walk out if you mention the E word. I have colleagues at McGill and Syracuse University who are collecting data from Islamic scientists and teachers to try to get an idea of what is actually going on in the classroom. So there's some support for these anecdotal reports that I heard a couple of years ago. But one of the things that we have learned is that textbooks are quite different from the textbooks that they use in Islamic countries are quite different from those that are used here. As an example, this Pakistani science textbook, which is written in English, by the way, the English is interspersed with passages from the Quran, which you see in the Arabic there. you may know that in Islam, the Quran cannot be translated. It must be read in Arabic, which is why so many young Muslims go to the Middle East to study Arabic. It's so they can read the Quran. In this book from Pakistan, evolution is presented as okay, but only because you can find things in the Quran that will justify it. And this is something that Hamid and his colleagues have found over and over. A particularly illuminating study, I think, was published in Reports of NCSE in 2010 by Lise Burton, comparing evolution education in Iran with that in Saudi Arabia. Now, both of these countries have top-down educational systems. They have mandatory use of state-approved textbooks. The Saudi Arabian textbooks are kind of like the Pakistani textbooks in that they are very subservient to Quran-approved science. If it's in the Quran, then it's okay. If you can justify it by twisting the words in the Quran somehow or another, then it's okay to teach the science. There are lots of references to Allah as creator, and the evolution coverage, though, is really pretty skimpy and negative, and I quote from one of these Saudi textbooks, "Evidence for the theory of evolution crumbles at the first test. It has merely resulted from misunderstanding, miscalculation, or the effects of scientific limitations, or due to imagination or speculation or deceit or forgery." That's our ally. In Iran, interestingly enough, although Iran is a theocracy, Iran has had a long history of Western-style education and a science curriculum that was really quite modern. Evolution was routinely and extensively taught, with one book having 40 pages on evolution, and there were only passing references to Allah or the Quran. Rather, in Iran, the concern was with the importance of learning science in order to help your nation progress, and there was a patriotic duty for you to become well-informed and educated in science. In both Iran and Saudi Arabia, human evolution was conspicuously absent, of course. Although the Iranian curriculum did discuss natural selection on humans, which is sort of an interesting thing. Well, what have we learned? It's really difficult to generalize given the many variables that affect anti-evolutionism and, of course, how culture and history affect them. I'm going to try to make a few generalizations, although, they are tentative. Much, much more to learn. Clearly, the rise of evangelical Protestantism around the world is an important concomitant of anti-evolutionism. You see this in Brazil, particularly, where in this formerly strongly Catholic country, now is 15% evangelical Christians. Obviously, this is also the case in Australia, where there's a pretty strong evangelical Christian movement. The internationalization of creationist ministries is not terribly important right now, but it probably is growing. It certainly influenced the situation in Brazil and Great Britain. And although I did not discuss data from South Korea is a country that has been strongly missionized by evangelical Protestant missionaries. There's a very strong Christian, and it's a conservative Christian movement in South Korea. And the Institute for Creation Research, AIG, the creationist organizations, do have pretty good footholds there. And of course, Turkey as well. The political activism of conservative religionists is illustrated again by Brazil. The head of the Rio de Janeiro province is an evangelical Christian. In Italy as well, the advisor to the education minister who promoted creationism is an evangelical Protestant. And yet, it's really not a simple situation either. Anti-evolutionism in Italy was also promoted by right-wing politicians who opposed evolution not so much because they associate it with religion, but that they equate evolution with Marxism. Politics is important in Turkey as well. Creationism is as much an anti-Western movement in Turkey as it is a pro-Islamic movement. Because to Harun Yahya, evolution is sort of a stand-in for Western culture, which is the big enemy, getting back to what he considers the important verities. And of course, the favorite, none of the above. Serbia falls here. The situation in Serbia was certainly not a case of any of these other characters, but seems likely just to be plain politics, maybe conservative politics. Cholak rolled back a number of other education reforms. She cut out language instruction and things like that. But basically, people were out for her hide, and that may be as much to do with her removal as, or bringing evolution back, as great enthusiasm for science education. I was lecturing in Japan in 2003, and I was absolutely shocked to hear that the education minister had dropped evolution from the high school biology curriculum. I thought, Japan? What is this? You people don't have a big fundamental... Well, that's because it didn't have anything to do with religion, didn't have anything to do with politics, didn't have anything to do with any of these other things on the list. What it had to do with is the education ministry realized that they were killing off Japanese kids by giving them this crushing burden of high school instruction. If you know anything about the life of a high school kid in Japan, it is not carefree. These kids are spending huge amount of times in class, and then they go home, get a quick snack, and then they go to post-school, and then on Saturdays and sometimes even Sundays, they have further study so they can prepare for their exams. So they were trying to lighten the curriculum a little bit so that there could be some sort of a balance, which is probably a good idea, but taking evolution out seemed to me not a very good idea. Some caveats. You maybe gathered from this that my opinion is that the creationism and evolution issue is not a simple one-variable problem. The prediction of where we could expect anti-evolutionism in the future is also not a simple matter. In the United States, a main factor is the decentralization of education. We don't have a national curriculum. We don't even have national standards, which is sort of a step up from curricula. Decisions about what gets taught are made at the district level, and actually the implementation is largely by the individual teacher, who may just decide to skip evolution because it's too controversial. We have those kinds of problems as well. And yet you can have centralized education systems like the Islamic countries in which the anti-evolutionism is top-down. So it's not centralization, decentralization as well. The proportion of the population that is secular versus religious may be a partial variable here. You're not likely to get as much anti-evolutionism in countries like France, Germany, or Great Britain, where the majority of the population is secular. But it's not even whether the population is religious or secular, because Saudi Arabia and Iran are both highly religious countries, and yet they vary quite a bit in the treatment of evolution. And I don't think it's just a Sunni Shia kind of thing either. There, the treatment of evolution differs more because of history and educational policy. Now, anti-evolutionism is increasing in Russia. It's associated with certainly evangelical Christian missionaries, which is one of the possible predictors. But it's also the case that the Russian Orthodox Church is being promoted by the government, not because the Communist Party has suddenly taken on religion as a great idea, but because Russian Orthodoxy really symbolizes to many Russians Mother Russia. And so there's this great historical and patriotic thing associated with the Orthodox Church. So I'm not going to dance. You've seen the Richard Dawkins tape, never mind. And a final caveat about Great Britain. The percentage of secularism here certainly is very high. But I would say the problems with the teaching of evolution that I anticipate you all having in your country will be a combination, shall we say, of the first and the third pillar. The secularization of Britain would sort of remove that second religious pillar, but you still have problems with the first pillar in that even though there's not this religious reason for opposing evolution in Great Britain, the citizens of Great Britain don't know very much about it. Okay? And when you don't know very much about it, you are easily misled when somebody comes up with plausibly, scientifically sounding arguments against something. We've been talking about that for a couple of days in terms of health and so forth, so I know you are familiar with what I'm talking about. And the fairness argument as I mentioned before, is really the best thing the creationists have going for them. They sure don't have any science. And they're even wrong about the religion. But boy, fairness, that really resonates with people who come from cultures like ours. And trust me, I'm not against free speech. I think this is a really important thing. I think fairness is great as a cultural tradition. It's just that science is not really fair, you know? I mean, sometimes when I'm at a college and I'm talking to a group of biologists, I'll say, okay, y'all, everybody who would prefer Lamarckism to natural selection, raise your hand. And everybody laughs and all the hands go up because, yeah, you know, Lamarckism is so much less nasty, brutish, and short than natural selection. Who wouldn't want to vote it in? Science doesn't work that way. We can't vote in the ideas we like and vote out the ideas we don't like. But the fairness argument is culturally very resonant with us. And so when somebody comes up and says, oh yeah, but you know, we've got all these kids in the class and they really don't want to hear about evolution, what harm would it do to just skip evolution this year? So I think that you are very likely to hear that. I think British teachers are very unlikely to say, well, let's be fair. Let's teach both heliocentrism and geocentrism, because they know that geocentrism isn't accurate science, but they really don't know that much about evolution. And word to the wise, those of you who are university professors, just as I harangue my colleagues back in the United States, you have to do a better job of teaching evolution at the university level, because it's the university level scientists who teach the people who become teachers, and that is where you're going to get your greatest trickle down. And in general, unless your university scientists are bringing evolution into all aspects of biology, really, you know, showing why evolution makes sense of biology and being explicit about it, the students aren't going to get it. They're not just going to pick it up through osmosis, a very good biological principle, mind you, but not a good one for learning. And as such, they won't be passing on these ideas to their students when they get out. So again, ncsc.com is our website where you can find a lot more information about this. Clearly, we have like all... Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. If you go to this link here, we have a free electronic newsletter that comes out every Friday, kind of like Bob Park's What's New, if you know that, just bulleted points, keeping you up to date on all the depressing things that are going on. And if you go to the news button up here on top, you can find out what's going on and be further depressed. ncsc.com is our website. We also have a Facebook site. We have a YouTube site that is totally cluttered with too many videos of me, but that's because I've been doing this for so long. We're getting more of my colleagues' excellent performances up there, and so I would encourage you to check that out as well. A number of years ago, the aforementioned publishers of Annals of Improbable Research, journal, there's two journals here, and I have friends who edit one and a friend who edits the other. The Annals of Improbable Research, there we go. These are the folks who have the Ig Nobel Prize ceremonies that you've heard about. Well, I was actually invited to come to one and do a 24/7. A 24/7 is where an expert in a field is given 24 seconds to summarize the scientific discipline, and then 7 words to describe it in a way that's understandable to even a child. So I thought I'd leave. My last parting shot with you is my 24/7. In the beginning, there was a big bang. Then hydrogen, stars, galaxies, planets, a pale blue dot, a replicating molecule, a cell, tissues, photosynthesis, metazoa, an inordinate number of beetles, lions and tigers and steves, oh my, and consciousness to figure it out and wonder at it all. Evolution is the history of the universe. Thank you for inviting me to QED.
Genie Scott, ladies and gentlemen.